All right, so get ready, because today we are diving deep, deep, deep into history.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking the entire British Empire.
The whole thing.
Based on this incredible 4K documentary, we're going to try to cover centuries of history.
Wow.
From how this little island nation
Right.
became this global superpower
Yeah.
and then ultimately declined.
And the massive story.
It is a massive story.
Yeah.
And the documentary does a really, really good job of kind of condensing it all down.
It really does.
And that's kind of our job here today, right? To sort of pull out the most fascinating parts.
Yeah.
So what moments?
Yeah.
So that we can understand how this whole empire thing even happened.
Totally.
How did it grow to span the entire world and then shrink back down?
That's the question. And it's so interesting to see how those very first steps, like way before anyone was thinking global empire or anything like that,
Right.
how those steps kind of set the stage for how they operated for centuries.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
So, okay, so the documentary starts way back. We're talking King Alfred
Okay.
fighting off Viking invaders,
Classic.
878 AD, the Treaty of Wedmore.
The Treaty of Wedmore.
Now, this isn't just some random peace treaty, is it?
No, not at all. Think of it like that. It wasn't just about stopping the fighting, right?
Okay, yeah.
It was a model for how England would basically deal with everyone they conquered
Oh, interesting.
from that point forward.
Okay.
They give the Vikings some land, keep some for themselves, and basically said, let's coexist
Right.
uneasily.
That's fascinating. So they were already thinking strategically,
Oh, yeah.
even back then.
Big time.
It makes you wonder if that uneasy peace, is that how they approach Ireland and Wales later on?
That's a great point. You can definitely see the parallels.
Yeah.
The conquest of Ireland in 1171
Right.
is especially interesting because it was their first real colony, like a testing ground almost, for how they would operate on a larger scale.
I was actually surprised by that.
Yeah.
I always just thought that Ireland was part of Britain, not a colony.
Right. Yeah.
But it makes sense. Like they were trying things out,
Yeah,
seeing what worked before taking it global.
totally. And some of those tactics they developed early on,
Oh, yeah.
like Edward I's castle building in Wales in the 1200s,
Okay.
beyond brute force,
All right.
They were thinking about how to control the land, how to really project their power.
So it's like they're accidentally creating like an empire building playbook
Totally.
without even realizing it yet.
And then they turn their attention westward. John Cabot's voyage, 1497.
Yep.
Boom. They've landed in Newfoundland.
Newfoundland.
Newfoundland, yeah.
Wow.
A whole new world of possibilities opening up.
But those early attempts at colonization, like the Roanoke colony, that was a disaster, right?
Oh, total disaster.
It seems like nature itself was fighting back.
Disease, conflict with native populations, just harsh conditions. Colonization wasn't just a matter of planting a flag and declaring victory.
No.
It was about survival. Adapting to new environments, navigating these complex relationships with the people who are already living there.
It's easy to forget about those struggles when you're looking at a map.
Yeah.
You see these lines and dates, and
Yeah.
you forget about the human cost of all that exploration.
Exactly. It wasn't just maps and territories.
Right.
It was real people
Yeah.
trying to make a life, often at the expense of others.
And then things get really, really interesting with the Spanish Armada in 1588.
Oh, yeah.
This massive fleet heading towards England. Talk about a David and Goliath situation.
Seriously, imagine you're standing on the English coast,
Right.
watching this seemingly invincible force approaching.
Yeah.
It must have been terrifying,
Uh-huh.
but also maybe a little bit exhilarating,
Yeah.
that underdog mentality,
Right.
facing impossible odds. It probably really galvanized the English spirit.
And they pulled off an incredible victory. Not only did they defend themselves, but they crippled the Spanish Empire in the process.
It was a huge turning point.
Do you think that was a turning point for British ambition on the world stage?
Oh, absolutely. It shifted the balance of power in Europe.
Yeah?
It paved the way for British naval dominance, which, as we know,
Right.
becomes key to their global expansion.
Absolutely.
They learned they could win.
Yeah.
Even against, a much larger force. And that confidence fueled their ambitions for centuries to come.
So the empire is taking shape, but the documentary doesn't shy away from the more brutal chapters either.
Yeah.
It jumps to the Caribbean, those early settlements in St. Kitts.
Right.
It's a complex and disturbing story. You see the initial cooperation with the French,
Right.
but then the Bloody Point Massacre in 1626, it kind of foreshadows the darker side of colonization.
Yeah.
This violence, this growing reliance on enslaved labor.
It's a reminder that the empire wasn't just built on, exploration and innovation. It had this foundation of exploitation woven right into its core.
And that massacre itself, it's a chilling example, right?
Right.
The settlers are fearing an attack by the native Kalinago people.
Right.
So they decide to strike first, wiping out a significant portion of their population.
Horrible.
It sets a precedent
Yeah.
for using violence and oppression as tools of control.
And that violence, it directly connects to the growth of the transatlantic slave trade, right?
Yeah.
This horrific system that generated so much wealth for the British Empire, but at an unimaginable human cost.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile those two things, the economic prosperity and the human cost.
Yeah, it is. It's a chilling reminder that progress and prosperity often came at a terrible price for those who were exploited and oppressed. And the documentary doesn't shy away from this moral complexity at all,
Right.
Highlighting the horrific conditions of the Middle Passage, the
Yeah.
brutal realities of plantation life.
From the Caribbean, the documentary shifts back over to the American colonies.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see this different kind of motivation for colonization.
Oh, yeah.
Religious freedom.
Right.
You've got the Puritans in Massachusetts seeking to create this city upon a hill.
The Puritans. They're fascinating. They really believed they were creating a model society, a beacon of righteousness. But their strict religious beliefs also led to a lot of intolerance and conflict. So it's a good reminder that the motivations for colonization were often complex
Right.
and multifaceted, driven by this mix of idealism, ambition,
Yeah.
and, let's be honest, a desire for power.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember the Puritans weren't the only ones, right?
No.
You had Catholics seeking refuge in Maryland,
Yeah.
Quakers in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So you've got this whole tapestry of motivations: religious freedom, economic opportunity,
Yeah.
the desire for land, the chance to start fresh.
It's almost like a social experiment
Right.
on this massive scale.
Exactly. But then back in England,
Yeah.
things kind of explode
Okay.
with the English Civil War. Suddenly, you've got this internal conflict, religious tensions, Charles I clashing with Parliament.
And this internal conflict spills over into the colonies. It influences events all across the Atlantic.
So the English Civil War is having global implications.
It is. It demonstrates how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that events in one part of the world can have ripple effects
Right.
that reach far beyond their borders.
So how does this war back in England, how does it actually impact the empire as a whole?
Well, for one, it leads to Cromwell's brutal campaign in Ireland
Right.
and the horrific massacres at Drogheda and Wexford. Those events are chilling examples of how far the British were willing to go to maintain control and suppress dissent.
Yeah.
It also highlights the religious tensions that were simmering beneath the surface, often erupting into violence and oppression.
Cromwell's actions in Ireland, they're about more than just religious persecution,
But
right?
you're right.
It connects to this the expansion of British influence in the Caribbean as well.
Exactly. Cromwell's Western design
Okay.
leads to the conquest of Jamaica,
Right.
further strengthening their grip on the Caribbean and its lucrative sugar trade.
Right.
This expansion was driven by a complex mix of religious and economic motivations, demonstrating how these forces were really intertwined.
It's amazing how the documentary weaves together all of these seemingly disparate events,
Yeah.
showing how they all contributed to the growth of this empire.
Right. History isn't just a series of isolated events.
Right.
It's a complex web of interconnected stories and motivations.
Absolutely.
And by understanding those connections, we can gain a much deeper appreciation for the forces that shaped the British Empire
Yeah.
and its lasting impact on the world.
Okay, so Cromwell's gone, Charles II is back on the throne, the Restoration, and he seems laser focused on expanding the empire overseas.
Yeah, Charles II was a key figure in the empire's growth. He understood the importance of trade,
Right.
particularly the increasingly lucrative and horrific.
Yeah, and horrific slave trade.
Yeah.
His establishment of the Royal African Company, granting them a monopoly on the slave trade, directly fueled the expansion of those sugar plantations in the Caribbean
Right.
and further enriched, the British coffers.
So we're seeing that slave trade becoming deeply, deeply intertwined with the British economy.
It is.
It's a source of immense wealth, but built on immense suffering.
A chilling reminder that progress and prosperity often came at a terrible price for those who were exploited and oppressed.
Yeah.
The documentary doesn't shy away from this moral complexity at all,
Right.
highlighting the horrific conditions of the Middle Passage,
Yeah.
the brutal realities of plantation life.
And this connects back to those early events in St. Kitts.
Absolutely, yeah.
The massacre of the Kalinago people created this reliance on enslaved labor that now drives the empire's economy.
Exactly. The legacy of violence and exploitation is woven into the very fabric of the empire,
Wow.
shaping its economic development, influencing its political and social structures. Then we have another political earthquake, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Oh, yeah.
William and Mary take the throne.
Yeah.
Power shifts from the monarchy to parliament. This is a defining moment for England.
It is.
But the documentary points out something really interesting,
Yeah.
that the Glorious Revolution had these echoes in the American colonies.
Oh, wow.
You have revolts in New York and Massachusetts,
Mm.
demonstrating that the colonists are developing their own ideas about governance,
Mm.
about who holds the power.
So while they're consolidating power in England,
Yeah,
the seeds of dissent are being sown in the American colonies.
it's like they're learning from their colonial masters, but also challenging their authority.
It's a pivotal moment. It really foreshadows the growing tensions that will lead to the American Revolution.
Right,
The colonists are developing a sense of their own identity,
right.
their own rights,
Yeah.
and they're not afraid to fight for them.
Then we're right back into conflict with the 9 Years' War. And this war seems like a forgotten conflict, overshadowed by later events.
It does.
But it's sprawling across the globe. We're talking Ireland, North America, the Caribbean.
Wow.
It feels like England is learning to fight on multiple fronts, testing strategies that they'll refine in later centuries.
You're absolutely right. The 9 Years' War was like a crucial training ground
Yeah.
for the British military. It forced them to adapt to all these different environments, to forge alliances with indigenous groups,
Right.
to develop the logistical and strategic skills necessary to manage a global conflict.
It's a war that really demonstrates their growing reach and ambition,
Uh-huh.
but also reveals the challenges of maintaining control
Right.
over such a vast and diverse territory.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It seems like this war solidified their role as a major player on the world stage,
Absolutely.
setting the stage for future conflicts and for their eventual dominance.
The 9 Years' War was a turning point, establishing them as a force to be reckoned with. And as we move into the 18th century, we'll see how this newfound confidence, coupled with their growing economic and military might, will propel them towards becoming a global superpower.
And amidst all this conflict, global trade is booming.
Yeah.
And the East India Company is starting to make its mark in India.
Oh, yeah.
They established Fort St. George in Madras in 1639, and it quickly becomes...
More than just a trading post, it's the embryo of something much larger, really, a center of political and military power that will gradually extend its influence over the entire subcontinent.
Wow.
We're witnessing the very beginnings of the British Raj here, though it will take decades and countless conflicts before it fully materializes.
So it's like a slow-motion takeover,
Yeah.
driven by economics and opportunity, but also by this sense of British superiority,
Oh, yeah.
this belief in their right to rule.
That's a key insight, and you'll see this sense of entitlement play out time and again as the empire expands. It's a potent mix of ambition, opportunity,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, a belief in their own inherent right to dominate others.
And that belief will ultimately lead to resistance, rebellion,
Yeah.
and the eventual dismantling of the empire itself.
It's a fascinating and tragic cycle.
It really is.
Yeah.
And as we move forward, keep in mind these early chapters, these seemingly insignificant events,
Right.
because they contain the seeds of what's to come.
Right.
The patterns established in those early conquests, those alliances and betrayals, those economic and religious motivations,
Yeah,
they all reverberate throughout the empire's history.
they do.
Wow, it's amazing how much ground we've already covered, from those early Viking battles to the East India Company setting up shop in India. And it feels like things are really starting to ramp up in the 1700s. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. The 18th century was a period of almost constant conflict for the British,
Yeah.
a time of expansion, consolidation of power. They were engaged in wars across the globe, from Europe to the Americas to India.
They just couldn't stay out of a fight, could they?
Apparently not.
But those wars weren't just about territory.
Right.
They were also about economics, trade routes, the control of valuable resources.
Exactly. Take the War of the Spanish Succession, for example.
Yeah.
Fought over control of the Spanish throne, but it had huge implications for trade and the balance of power in Europe.
Wow.
The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war, gave Britain control of key territories, including Gibraltar and Newfoundland. And it granted them the Asiento de Negros,
Okay.
which gave them a monopoly on the slave trade with Spanish America.
So even these European conflicts were shaping the future of the empire in far-flung corners of the world.
Oh.
It's also a stark reminder that the slave trade was a central part of their economic strategy, this horrific system that they were willing to fight wars to protect.
It's a dark side of the empire that's impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
And it's a legacy that continues to haunt us today as we grapple with the lasting impact of slavery and colonialism.
But amidst all this conflict, there's also this sense of innovation and progress. This is the time of the Enlightenment.
Right.
New ideas are spreading, challenging old ways of thinking, and that must have had an impact on the empire as well.
Oh, the Enlightenment had a profound impact on the British Empire, both positive and negative. On one hand, it fostered this belief in progress, reason, individual liberty.
Right.
This led to reforms like the abolition of the slave trade, which we'll talk about later. But on the other hand, Enlightenment ideas about rationality, scientific classification, these were often used to justify racial hierarchies, to reinforce that belief in European superiority.
It's a reminder that even seemingly progressive ideas can be used to justify oppression and exploitation. But let's shift our focus to one of the most significant conflicts of this era. The 7 Years' War, a truly global war, fought on 3 continents.
The 7 Years' War was a defining moment for the British Empire. A war that really solidified their dominance on the world stage, had lasting consequences for the future of their colonies. It was a clash of empires, with Britain and France battling for control of North America, India, other key territories.
And in North America, we see a young George Washington making his first appearance on the historical stage.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think about those early experiences shaping the man who would later lead the American Revolution.
It is. Washington's early military experience, his encounters with the British and the French, understanding of wilderness and frontier warfare, all that played a role in his development as a leader.
Right.
And the 7 Years' War itself had a profound impact on the relationship between Britain and its American colonies.
In what way? Did the war kind of plant the seeds for the American Revolution?
In many ways, yes. The colonists fought alongside the British, gained valuable military experience, developed a sense of their own strength, their autonomy.
Right.
But the war also led to tensions over taxes and British control, as the colonists resented having to bear the financial burden of a war that they felt primarily benefited the mother country.
So the war that was supposed to solidify British power actually ended up sowing the seeds of its decline.
Yeah.
Almost ironic, like they created their own worst enemy.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences.
It really is.
And while the war raged in North America, it was also having a dramatic impact on the other side of the world, in India.
The documentary highlights the Black Hole of Calcutta, this horrific incident where British prisoners were allegedly suffocated in this small dungeon.
Oh, God.
It sounds like something out of a nightmare, and it must have fueled outrage, a desire for revenge.
It was a shocking event, really captured the public imagination, solidified that image of the East India Company as a ruthless and uncaring power.
Right.
It also led to the Battle of Plassey, a decisive British victory that further cemented their control over Bengal, and really marked a turning point in the company's rise to dominance.
And then you see the rise of Robert Clive,
Yeah.
a controversial figure, brilliant military strategist, but also accused of corruption, brutality. He seems like a perfect embodiment of the contradictions of the empire.
He does.
Capable of great achievements, but also responsible for terrible acts.
Clive is a complex and fascinating character, and his story speaks to those ethical dilemmas of empire building.
Yeah.
He was undoubtedly a skilled leader, a key figure in expanding British power in India, but his methods were often ruthless, and his actions had devastating consequences for the people of India.
So the 7 Years' War ends with Britain victorious. But the seeds of future conflict are sown. They've gained vast territories, but also created new enemies, ignited this growing desire for independence in the American colonies. What a turning point.
It was a pivotal moment, a time of both triumph and foreshadowing.
Right.
The British Empire was at the height of its power, but the cracks were beginning to show.
And speaking of cracks, with the loss of America, the British Empire has to rethink its strategy.
Yeah.
They're forced to look for new opportunities for expansion, and their attention turns to this vast and unexplored continent, Australia.
The loss of America was a blow to British pride and their prestige,
Right.
but it forced them to adapt, to really reassess their priorities, to seek new avenues for economic and political influence.
Yeah.
Australia, with its vast landmass and untapped resources, it seemed to offer a fresh start,
Yeah.
a chance to build a new colony on their own terms.
The documentary describes James Cook's voyages and his discovery of Australia,
Right.
highlighting its unique features and its potential as a penal colony.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating but also troubling story. The idea of using a whole continent as a dumping ground for convicts.
It is. It's a complex and often overlooked chapter in the history of the British Empire. The decision to establish a penal colony in Australia was driven by a number of factors: overcrowding in British prisons, a desire to exploit the continent's resources, a belief in the transformative power of exile and hard labor.
But of course, this new start came at a tremendous cost for the Aboriginal people of Australia,
Of course.
who were displaced, dispossessed, and subjected to violence and oppression.
Absolutely. The arrival of the British in Australia had a devastating impact on the indigenous population, leading to widespread displacement, disease, and cultural disruption. It's a tragic story that really mirrors the experiences of indigenous peoples throughout the history of the British Empire.
Yeah.
A reminder of the dark side of colonization, the enduring legacy of injustice.
It's a reminder that even as the empire is evolving, even as it's seeking these new frontiers and adapting to new challenges, certain patterns repeat themselves. Certain injustices persist.
It makes you wonder if they ever truly learned from their mistakes.
That's a question historians continue to debate. Did the British Empire ever truly confront the moral implications of its actions? Did they ever truly understand the damage they were inflicting on the people and the cultures they sought to control?
These are tough questions.
They are.
They force us to confront the complexities of history, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. But as we move into the 19th century, there are these glimmers of hope, signs of progress, a growing awareness of the need for change. One of the most significant developments of this period was the abolition of the slave trade.
Yeah.
In 1807, after decades of campaigning by abolitionists, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal for British subjects to engage in the transatlantic slave trade.
It was a landmark achievement,
Huge.
a victory for human rights.
Uh-huh.
It's a testament to the power of social movements to bring about change.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, this act only outlawed the trading of slaves, not slavery itself.
Right.
It would take another 26 years for slavery to be abolished throughout the British Empire.
That's right. The fight for abolition was a long and arduous one. And even after the slave trade was outlawed, the institution of slavery persisted for decades,
Yeah.
supported by powerful economic interests and deeply ingrained social attitudes.
So it's a step in the right direction,
Oh, yeah.
a sign of progress, but it's not the end of the story. The fight for justice and equality continued. And while this moral battle is being waged, the Napoleonic Wars are raging in Europe, disrupting trade, challenging British naval supremacy. It feels like they're constantly fighting on multiple fronts, both militarily and ideologically.
It was a tumultuous period, a time of global upheaval and uncertainty. The Napoleonic Wars had a profound impact on the British Empire, draining its resources, testing its alliances, forcing it to adapt to a rapidly changing world. And while they were battling Napoleon in Europe, they were also facing new challenges in their colonies, as the seeds of discontent and rebellion continued to grow.
And nowhere was this more evident than in India, where the East India Company was expanding its control, annexing territories, and increasingly asserting its authority over the subcontinent.
The East India Company had become a powerful force in India, operating almost as a state within a state. They had their own army, their own laws. They were increasingly intervening in local politics and economics. This expansion, however, was met with growing resistance from Indian rulers, from the people themselves,
Right.
resenting the company's growing power and influence.
And this tension explodes in one of the most dramatic chapters in the empire's history, the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857.
Right.
This isn't just a minor uprising, it's a full-blown rebellion, a challenge to the very foundation of British rule in India.
The Sepoy Rebellion was a watershed moment,
Yeah.
a turning point that really exposed the vulnerabilities of the British Empire,
Yeah.
revealed the deep resentment that had been brewing beneath the surface. It was a complex event fueled by a mix of religious tensions, cultural clashes, resentment of British policies.
The documentary doesn't shy away from the violence on both sides, the massacres, the sieges, the brutal reprisals. It's a dark chapter, a reminder of the human cost of empire, the brutality that often accompanied the pursuit of power.
It was a traumatic event for both the British and the Indians, leaving deep scars on both societies, shaping the future of their relationship for decades to come.
And one of the key consequences of the rebellion is that it marks the end of East India Company rule in India.
It does.
The British government takes direct control, ushering in the era of the British Raj.
The Sepoy Rebellion was a turning point, not just for India, but for the British Empire as a whole. It forced them to confront the limitations of their power, the fragility of their control, and the need for a new approach to governing their vast and diverse empire.
So the empire enters a new phase, more centralized, more directly controlled by the British government. But as we move deeper into the 19th century, it seems like they're facing challenges on all sides.
Mhm.
There's the Black War in Tasmania, the Opium Wars in China, the New Zealand Wars, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, the Ashanti Wars in West Africa. It's almost like they're constantly putting out fires, struggling to maintain control.
Yeah, these conflicts reveal the growing resistance to British rule, the cracks in the facade of their imperial power.
Right. They're facing challenges not just from external enemies, but from within their own colonies, as the people they seek to control are becoming increasingly aware of their own rights and their own desire for self-determination.
And yet, despite these challenges, the Victorian era sees the British Empire at its peak.
Right.
They control a quarter of the world's landmass, their navy rules the seas, their culture and language are spreading across the globe. It's a time of immense wealth and power, a golden age of empire.
It is. The Victorian era was a time of contradictions, a time of both progress and exploitation, immense wealth and grinding poverty, a belief in progress, and a deep-seated fear of decline. It was a time when the British Empire seemed invincible, yet the seeds of its eventual downfall were already being sown.
And speaking of seas of downfall, the scramble for Africa is a fascinating and tragic chapter in the empire's history.
It is.
This mad dash to carve up the African continent, fueled by competition and greed, it seems like a recipe for disaster. It was. The scramble for Africa was a prime example of the arrogance and short-sightedness of European imperialism. Driven by a mix of economic, political, and strategic motivations, European powers, including Britain, raced to claim territories in Africa, often with little regard for the people who lived there, the consequences of their actions.
The Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where European powers sat around a table, drew lines on a map, dividing up Africa amongst themselves.
Yeah.
It's almost unbelievable that they thought they could just decide the fate of millions of people without their consent.
It was a blatant act of colonialism, a clear demonstration of that belief in European superiority and the right to dominate and exploit other cultures. The consequences of this arbitrary division of Africa are still being felt today in the form of political instability, economic inequality, and ethnic conflicts.
It's a reminder that even though the British Empire is long gone, its legacy continues to shape the world we live in today, both for better and for worse. And as we enter the 20th century, the world is changing rapidly.
Yeah.
The empire is facing new challenges that will ultimately lead to its demise.
The 20th century was a period of profound transformation, a time of war, revolution, and the rise of new ideologies and global powers. The British Empire, weakened by World War I, facing growing pressure from nationalist movements in its colonies, it would eventually crumble, giving way to a new world order. But its legacy, complex and contradictory, it would continue to shape the world for generations to come.
And as we delve deeper into the 20th century, we'll see how the empire adapts, how it struggles to maintain its grip on power, and ultimately how it comes to terms with its own decline. It's mind-blowing to think that at one point the British Empire seemed almost untouchable. But as we enter the 20th century, those cracks we were talking about, they're starting to widen. You've got the Second Boer War, the rise of nationalism in India. The world is shifting.
It is.
And the empire's struggling to keep up.
The 20th century brought about some serious upheaval, that's for sure. The Second Boer War, for example, was a brutal and costly conflict.
Yeah.
Really tarnished the image of the empire, fueled anti-colonial sentiment both at home and abroad. It exposed the limits of British military power, and it revealed a growing discontent within the colonies themselves.
And then you've got the rise of figures like Mahatma Gandhi in
Yeah,
India,
right.
his philosophy of nonviolent resistance, those incredible moments like the Salt March,
Yeah.
they really captured the world's attention,
They did.
demonstrated the power of peaceful protest.
Gandhi was a transformative figure, not just for India, but for the global anti-colonial movement as a whole. His strategy of satyagraha, of truth and nonviolence, it challenged the very foundations of British rule. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of the empire and inspired millions to demand their freedom.
And of course, World War I throws everything into chaos.
Yeah.
How did that global conflict change the landscape for the British Empire?
World War I was a turning point for the British Empire and for the world. It drained their resources, weakened their economy, and exposed the vulnerabilities of that old imperial system. It also unleashed all these new forces.
Yeah.
Nationalism, self-determination, the rise of new global powers like the United States.
It feels like that's when the balance of power really shifted. Suddenly, this once mighty empire is looking vulnerable, and those calls for independence are getting louder and louder.
Exactly. The war was a catalyst for change, accelerated the decline of European empires, and it inspired colonial subjects to fight for their own destinies. The world was entering a new era, and the old imperial order was crumbling.
And nowhere is this more evident than in India.
Right.
After the war, that independence movement gains even more momentum.
It does.
And the British are forced to confront the reality that they can't hold on forever.
The push for independence in India was relentless, fueled by the sacrifices made during the war, the inspiration of Gandhi's leadership, and a growing sense of national identity. The British faced a dilemma: cling to power and risk further conflict, or negotiate a peaceful transition to independence.
And ultimately, in 1947, they choose the latter. India gains its independence, but the process is far from smooth. You've got the partition of India and Pakistan, the violence, the displacement. It's a reminder that freedom often comes at a high price.
It does. The partition was a tragic and bloody affair, a testament to the complexities of decolonization and that enduring legacy of imperial rule. It's a stark reminder that the end of empire doesn't automatically erase the divisions, the wounds, the injustices of the past.
It's a sobering thought, a reminder that history has consequences.
It does.
But with India's independence, this domino effect begins. Decolonization sweeps across the globe, and the British Empire, this once vast and seemingly invincible force, it shrinks rapidly.
The sun was setting on the British Empire, as it was for all European empires. It was a time of both liberation and upheaval, a time of both hope and uncertainty. The world was being remade, and the old colonial order was giving way to a new, multipolar world.
So what's the lasting legacy of the British Empire?
Yeah.
The documentary really focuses on the negative aspects.
Yeah.
The exploitation, the violence, the cultural suppression.
Yeah.
But is that the whole story?
It's certainly a crucial part of the story, and it's important to acknowledge the lasting damage inflicted on colonized peoples and the systems of inequality that were created. But the legacy is more nuanced than that.
Yeah, and one of the things that the documentary kind of hints at but doesn't fully explore is that cultural legacy of the empire. The spread of the English language, the influence on literature and art, the exchange of ideas. Those things are harder to measure, but they're still a part of the story, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, absolutely. Think about it. English is a global language because of the British Empire. And with language comes a whole set of cultural assumptions, literary traditions, ways of thinking. That's a powerful and lasting legacy.
It's like a cultural ripple effect,
Yeah.
spreading outwards from those tiny islands to every corner of the world. And it makes me think about all the cultural exchanges that must have happened. The fusion of traditions, the impact on art, music, food.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Think about the influence of Indian textiles and design on British fashion, or the popularity of curry in Britain.
Yeah.
These cultural exchanges, they flowed both ways, creating a complex and vibrant tapestry of influences that we still see today.
It's a reminder that even within the context of colonialism, there were these moments of connection, of creativity, of shared experiences that transcended those power dynamics.
It's crucial to recognize those complexities, to avoid those simplistic narratives of good versus evil. The British Empire was a complex, multifaceted entity capable of both great brutality and great innovation, of both exploitation and cultural exchange.
And I think that's what makes studying history so fascinating, so important. It's not about memorizing dates and battles. It's about grappling with those complexities, understanding the human stories, the motivations, the consequences of those choices that shape the world we live in today.
Exactly. History is a conversation, a debate, An ongoing process of trying to make sense of the past and its relationship to the present. It's a conversation we all need to be a part of.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the history of the British Empire, I'm left with a lot to think about. It's a reminder that history is not just something that happened long ago and far away. It's alive in the world around us.
It shapes our language, our culture, our political systems, our understanding of the world. It's a legacy that we inherit, and it's up to us to decide how we engage with it, how we learn from it, and how we use that knowledge to create a more just and equitable future.
Well said. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey through time. We hope you've gained some new insights, some food for thought, and maybe even a renewed appreciation for the power and complexity of history. Until next time.